Go ahead and be seated. There is this temptation, I think, in our culture in particular, to jump from Christmas sometimes with presents and babies to next Sunday morning with bunnies and eggs and flowers. And this is the part people sometimes like to skip, both as Christians in the church and actually culturally as a whole. On this day, Jesus dies. There's a whole psychology around what we say when we try to avoid saying the words dying and death. Right? Expired, past, left us. When we allow ourselves to live in metaphor about that particular thing, they've actually done studies that show that it impedes grief. Today, Jesus dies. And if you have bandwidth today or tomorrow, I hope you make some time to allow yourself to sit with that at least a little. As a modern American happiness-focused culture, we deprive ourselves a little of the impact of Easter in our unwillingness to acknowledge both sin and death. We would like somehow to have redemption from those things without first having those things. Today, Jesus dies, and he is mocked and tortured and dies the death of a criminal. And then he is laid to rest in a cave. In other words, his death is sort of spectacularly terrible. John's gospel is the most reassuring account we have of that. Jesus in John's gospel is confident. He's in charge. He's poised. Even on the cross, he's looking after people. And that offers reassurance, and it is true, but also spend some time with Mark's account of that, with the other accounts of that. Jesus, fully human, experiences what it is to suffer and to die, to be alone and to feel abandoned. And that is really important in our sense of who we are, fully human, as people of faith in a God who becomes incarnate, who becomes flesh, who inhabits our same space. Death in our culture, we try to sanitize. We try to protect children from it. There is a whole industry around making that as tidy and invisible as possible. In a lot of families, that actually pretty quickly leaves the house and goes to a place of work. That didn't used to be the case. There was a moment in time when somebody died where they were laid out at home, right? That's still true in some cultures, but Western culture, Western sort of North American culture, doesn't necessarily hold space for that very well. Jesus belonged to a culture that did that a little better. And in fact, the early church had a ministry around caring for the bodies of the deceased. It was kind of a church membership drive reality that since death is expensive, one of the benefits of dying as a member of a church in the classical world was that they would take care of your body and see that you were buried. And the early Christian church saw a lot of death as the empire which killed Jesus sought also to stamp out his followers. I was struck by the reading actually we heard yesterday from 1 Corinthians, where Paul says we proclaim Christ's death until he comes. I thought that was so interesting. We are quicker, I think, to talk about his life, ministry, and then we want to jump to resurrection and ascension. Oh. I think it is worthwhile, at least on this one day, to stop in the place where Jesus dies, to let that have its full weight and to acknowledge that that is also our reality. It is part of being human. We say that Jesus dies for us. And in the popular culture, there is a fascination with the people who are willing to die for other people. We love a hero. We see that a lot in Marvel movies, for example, in television shows. And what you'll notice is that in our stories, our fictional stories, the ones we like, the main characters, the central characters, tend to not die. When they do something which approaches death, then miraculously in the next episode or the sequel, it turns out they were just frozen at the bottom of the ocean and we can rescue them and they can go on to star in more movies. It doesn't prepare us particularly well for the reality that we are the main characters sometimes in our own lives, and yet we also will die. I was listening to a Gregorian monk talk about the practice they have that before they make their final vows, they must fill out and submit their final arrangements. Right? They must answer all the questions. Who would you most like to speak at your funeral? What hymns might you want played at your funeral? And he said the first time he did this, he was in his 20s. And he kept thinking, but I'm so young. And then he said, but the thing is, death can come at any time. So, some of you will know that I worked for hospice. Also, before that, I volunteered with a wonderful organization called No One Dies Alone, which is an organization that takes it in shifts to sit with people who are dying, who have no family or friends to be present with them. I commend it to you. I imagine they're back up and running after COVID. So I have maybe slightly more experience with what it looks like for someone to be dying. And I can tell you that not once did refusing to acknowledge that or talk about it make things better. And the good news in this space is that it is possible to be at least a little prepared. Not fully prepared. I don't know that I think an awful lot of people are ever fully prepared. But there are reasonable steps to take that actually can improve relationship. They can improve quality of life. They can make death easier on all of the people that it affects. It can even grow faith. And practically thinking about that and thinking about the details of that is easier when you are not already grieving. Grief can make a lot of detail work a little bit harder. I visited with a funeral director at one point who said it is a good day when the people coming in to make arrangements are not actually facing imminently anybody's death. So I submit that to you as a practical consideration. But here's the thing. People who have reckoned in a real way with their own mortality make better choices about how they live. Which is to say, they make choices that more closely align with what they hope to have had as a life. Right? So that they can say, I did a pretty good job on my bucket list. My family knows I love them. And one of my favorites, I know where I'm going when I die. Speaking truth about death also enables us to speak truth about a whole passel of other things that we also don't always do a good job speaking truth about. Things like health and money and family dynamics. The things we leave unsaid have the capacity to rob us of relationship. In Christianity, we have a word for that. What are the things that rob us of relationship? So, it is no accident that Jesus, before he dies, spends really a lot of time talking to his people. Sit down and look through, like, the sheer volume of words. The entirety of chapter 17 is a prayer. It's all just him talking to God out loud so that his people can hear him express what he wants them to know about God about who he is and who we all are and how it all fits together. There's something like 5 chapters of John that are all like one 24-hour period. It's not that big of a book when you consider that it's 3 years, right? So it's huge. And if you don't know in a way that you can tell a 7-year-old what it is Jesus tells his people in those chapters, then as we go into Easter, I invite you to spend some time with that. That's a gift. That's a huge gift. And if you're not sure what you believe about that, I invite you also to think about what are the hymns you would have played at your funeral. Hymns are huge theology, right? They're theology tied to music that gets in our heart. That's a huge indicator of what we love and what we believe. So that is another source. Or poetry is another wonderful place to go. I have a favorite. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but it is called Crossing the Bar, and it is by Tennyson. And it uses language for death that evokes going home and hopefulness and the confidence that I will meet my guide when I get there. Notice what works for you. Go through the gospel and really sit with it. It is the gift of our faith that Jesus became flesh and died, right? The people I know who were least afraid of dying, among them were often the people who had almost died before. It had less of an unknown, and often they came away saying, oh no, that was going to be very peaceful, I could tell. Hiding it away and pretending like it's not a thing, I really believe doesn't buy us very much. We have in our tradition also our saints who have a lot of language that they give us around both death and then around Easter. I'm trying so hard to stay right here because there is that almost overwhelming impetus toward the first Eucharist that comes tomorrow. But this year's Lent Madness, the winner of the Golden Halo is a mystic and theologian whose name is Julian of Norwich. She was a lay person, and we actually know very little about her life. Even her name, we think, probably came from the town or the church where she lived. We have to read her work in translation. It is in English, but it's Chaucer's English. So if you speak fluent Chaucer, then you can read Julian in the original. She is known for her optimistic theology, most famously for her expression, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. But she didn't shy away from the nitty-gritty. She writes compellingly about her desire to share in Christ's passion. She prayed for and received a near-death experience. She writes that she hoped, by the grace of God, to live more fully for his sake alone. And when she expresses reluctance to leave this life, she says she just felt she needed more time to prepare to meet God. I find that so resonant. Not ready. She lived in the 1300s. In 1373, she received a series of 16 visions. They're called her showings. And she would spend most of the rest of her life reflecting on those showings, some 40 years. She writes of the love and goodness of God. She writes thoughtfully about sin, which she says is a truth, but she says it's a lesser truth that will be absorbed by the greater truth of the love of God. And she was unfazed by death. She's called an anchoress. It means she lived in basically a little cell that was attached to the outside wall of a church. And then there was like a tiny little window to the church so that the anchoress could take communion and observe the goings on. But that process of becoming an anchoress involved a dug grave in that cell. And the ceremony resembles a funeral. And then when it came time, that person, if they had decided to make that their life, would crawl into that grave. And they would sprinkle them with dirt and say prayers. And then they would bolt the door. She was aware of her own death, you could say. I'm going to leave you with this. She writes of Christ, "He dwells in us in infinite bliss, drawing us ever deeper inward. He wants us to be his helpers in this inner work, giving him all our attention, learning his teachings, keeping his laws, desiring that his will be done in all ways, and trusting him completely. I saw that our true essence is one with God." Amen.